Okay, welcome. Week 13, I believe it is, of REL 2930. How are y'all doing? Been a very interesting couple of weeks on college campuses, that's for sure, but if I could spend our whole time talking about that, but let's move on and talk about what we have to talk about today. Um, this lecture is on Christian art, but what I think I'm going to do is try to encompass all the past few weeks together, if I can. And do it briefly and succinctly. A lot of summarizing going on. Because I don't think the discussion on Christian art makes a lot of sense if you don't ground it in the context of the history of the thing and the modern age and how that works and the tensions that are inherent and how Christianity responds. Any discussion of Christian art, I think, needs to have that context. So I'm going to try to wrap in a lot of the conversations we've been having, a lot of the stuff you've been reading, into one thing. So that'll be fun to see if I can do that. But before I do, a little housekeeping. The paper, I'm sorry about the syllabus. It was kind of vague. I went and changed it. So on the syllabus, you have the due date exactly when the paper's due. November 22nd, 11:59. So that's that Sunday night, November 22nd. So you have 9 days. Be in contact with me if you have any questions, if you need any help. You also, if you wish, you can send me drafts, and I will do my level best to give you feedback on them as quickly as I can. So, don't send me 16 drafts, but, if you want to send me a draft, say, hey, is this kind of what you're thinking? I'll look at it, and I'll look at it quickly and give you some feedback and say, yep, you're on the right track, or no, I would do this, to try to give you some adjustments. I won't do that 11 o'clock at night on the 22nd, obviously. Again, it's doing an hour. I'm not doing that. But if you give me a few days ahead of time, just even if you give me something in the next couple of days, that would be ideal, because I could turn it around and give it back to you and say, hey, I like this, or I'm not really sure what you're doing here. You do have that option available to you should you choose to use it. And like I said, I make no promises for turnaround times, but I would try to get turned around on that as fast as I could. So, the paper's coming. That's the thing that's probably foremost on everyone's mind right now. Just remember, there's a paper, and the week after there's a summary of your paper. So you write the thing, and then you give us a little bullet summary description of what you learned in the process. And that's so we can share all of our learning together. But you'll see that as it starts to come closer. But the big thing right now is the paper itself, November 22nd, 11:59 p.m. So, okay, so today, the modern age, faith, science, literature as well, artwork. We got out of silence. And thank you for your feedback on silence. It was interesting. It's a troubling book, and your responses reflected that. So I thought it was interesting to read. But you got out of silence. What's silence talking about? Well, silence is talking about missionary expansion, right? Talking about these Jesuit missionaries who go to Japan and what befalls them there and what they learn there. But even on a broader level, it's talking about missionary expansion. Missionaries from Western countries going to non-Western countries, going from quote-unquote Christian nations to quote-unquote non-Christian nations, and what that transaction, what that interaction looks like, what that connection looks like. 17th and 18th is all the way through the 19th century. There was a lot of missionary expansion. The missionary activity during the 19th century, that was the century of missionaries. The 19th century was just crazy in the amount of missionary activity, going to far-flung places and establishing Christian outposts in a lot of the far corners of the world. We'll talk today how that's changed. It has changed. But we'll talk about how that is. But my point to bring all that up and to start is silence talks about what happens when Western nations, representatives, missionaries from Western nations go to non-Western nations with the gospel, with Christianity. The stuff you read last week talks about what was going on back home. What did Christianity itself look like in Europe, in America? How was it shifting? How was it changing? It was going through some pretty rapid, pretty profound changes because it was facing some pretty profound pressures. So that's kind of the main thrust of what we're talking about. So just to give you the backdrop, we talked about Martin Luther and the Reformation, what that did, the rise of denominations. We're not all Catholics anymore. We're Catholics, but also we're Lutherans, we're Anabaptists, we're Calvinists, we're all these different things. We're Methodists, we're Pietists. It all starts to explode. Reformations leads to divisions. Divisions lead to religious wars. Catholics kill Protestants. Protestants kill Catholics, and everyone kills the Anabaptists. This goes on for quite a long time, and there's a lot of warfare where you have nations fighting religious wars, and there's a gray area between what constitutes a religious war and what constitutes a political war. But what's undisputed is that religion plays a major conflict in all of these. So much so that Europe eventually says, we can't do this. We are literally killing each other and literally destroying Europe. We can't do this anymore. We need tolerance. We need for me to have my little zone, you to have your little zone, and live and let live, okay? So that's obviously generalizing, but that's kind of the stance that's taken. You have nations that say, we're Catholic. And as long as you play by the rules, nobody's going to kill you here. You have other nations that say, we're Protestant. And as long as you play by the rules, we're not going to kill you here. And what that leads to, or what that results in, is this kind of stratified social lines, where it's like, and if I'm a Protestant, I'm not going to go missionarying, if that's a word. I'm not going to be a missionary in a Catholic nation. It's just, it doesn't. The missionary impulse started to be, at least in Europe, started to be discouraged. And it's interesting. I mean, we talk a lot about the connections between denomination and national identity. I mean, you see that even today. Like, I have a friend of mine who's Scottish, and it's even down to the football team that he roots for. I had no idea. I'm such a newbie at soccer. I'm getting into it. I like it. I don't know much about it. I went to an Orlando City match and struck up a conversation with a guy from there. And he's, who's your team? Who do you support? And having that conversation. And the team that he supports back in Europe, Rangers, is and he said, we are a Protestant team. I said, wait, what? And apparently Rangers, the football team support, soccer team support, was connected to a nationalistic impulse. We are Scottish, but we are pro-Queen. We are pro-Great Britain. We are pro-unity, if you will. And we're also Protestant, Church of England. There's this other football team, Celtic. They're Catholics. They're Irish. They're not. They're anti-Queen. They're opposed to that. They're nationalist. And we hate them. Quote unquote, we hate them. And I'm sitting here. I'm a religion nerd. I don't know much about soccer, but I'm sitting here just fascinated by this. But the reason I tell you that story is to say, that this stuff still happens. You still have, very sharp dividing lines sometimes that are drawn between Catholic, Protestant, and it goes back to political stuff. It even goes back to football. Me as the American, I'm going, I don't understand. I'm not even having a hard time processing this. But there is that sort of division and that sense of, all right, I'm going to be who I am, you be who you are, and, there won't be that much back and forth, but at least we won't kill each other so long as we kind of stay in our lanes. That is the general mindset after the religious wars and after Europe kind of collectively goes, we can't do this anymore. And this is the backdrop. This is the backdrop for the Glorious Revolution in Britain in 1688. And all of that Enlightenment philosophy, which directly influences the American Revolution. McGrath talks about John Locke. He wrote something called A Letter Concerning Toleration in 1689. The word tolerance, this is kind of a forerunner of that. Right on the heels of the Glorious Revolution, he is the most influential Enlightenment philosopher. There is John Locke and there's everyone else. If you think about Jefferson, he read his Locke. Ben Franklin, all of the Founding Fathers knew who this guy was, read his work, was influenced by his work. Just incredibly influential. So what he argues, and McGrath summarizes this, but what he argues is that the state can't adjudicate competing religious claims. You can't have Catholics and Protestants, for example, fighting amongst each other and the government saying, all right, you're wrong. The political machinery just it's not equipped for that. And the second thing he says is, even if it could, the state could not compel adherence to a religious tradition. The state can't force you to be a good Catholic. It can't force you to be a good Lutheran. It can provide a favorable atmosphere. It can facilitate action that is in accordance with that religious tradition. But the state can't reach into your heart and make you an obedient Lutheran, an obedient Catholic, an obedient Methodist. It just doesn't have it in it. And his third point was, if it tried to legislate, you know the old saying, you can't legislate morality. It's an offshoot of Locke. It's basically what Locke is saying, because it says the state's not equipped to do it. It can't force you to be a good Christian, a good Catholic, a good Lutheran. And if it tried, the results would be disaster. As we've seen, the extension of Locke's argument, as we've seen all these religious wars and all these Europeans killing other Europeans. So what Locke is saying there is, there's got to be something else that determines the behavior, that determines the standard of behavior, and all of us getting along together. We can't rely on a specific religious tradition because we don't all agree on these religious traditions, and what happens when we don't all agree. So what they're dealing with is the beginnings of, for better or for worse, pluralist society. We're all together in this in public space. We all believe different things. How in the world do we get along? And this gives rise to, this is one of the forces that gives rise to the Age of Reason. If you've ever heard the history of the Enlightenment, it's often called the Age of Reason. Why? Because reason comes to be elevated above revelation. Reason comes to be elevated as this, the end-all, be-all of humanity. If you ask the Enlightenment philosophers, what makes a human being a human being? It's their ability to reason. It's their ability to think. It's their ability to have this that differentiates them from everything else in nature. It's the most important faculty that the human being has. Remember Descartes, I think, therefore I am. My ability to think, my ability to use reason to solve problems is what sets me apart. It's not my religious tradition. It's not anything else. It's my ability to use reason. So the Enlightenment view then elevates reason above these religious traditions and uses reason as a means to explain these different religious traditions and where they all fit. And this is where you get started. And kind of a modern iteration of this idea is the old story, the blind man and the elephant. You've probably heard this. And the story goes, there's an elephant, and there's three blind men, and they're all stationed at different parts of the elephant. They're feeling the elephant. And they're making arguments on what the elephant is based on what they're feeling. So, the one person has got the trunk. He says, "Oh, look, it's a hose." The other one says, "Oh, he's got the side." "Oh, it's a tree trunk. This is enormous." The other one has the ear and says, "Oh, it's a giant fan." But the point of the story is they're all experiencing the same thing, but in profoundly different ways. So in the Age of Reason, the capacity of reason is the person who is looking at these blind men doing this and explaining to you what's going on. So the voice of reason, the Enlightenment view, the voice of reason, looks at all these religious traditions, because the blind men represent people with their religious traditions, right? They're trying to get at the ultimate, they're trying to get at the divine, they're trying to get at God, but they're going about it different ways. You need the Enlightenment view says you need the rationalist philosopher to come explain to you what you're doing. So this is the major development of the Enlightenment. We're throwing off the shackles of religious superstition. We're throwing off the shackles of ignorance. We're embracing our destiny as rational beings. And we are going to function in the world by means of our reason. This is how we're going to have success in the world. This is how we're going to stop killing each other. This is how we're going to get along. And this is how we're going to flourish in the age to come. And the belief behind reason was this sense of, it's omnicompetent. It can figure anything. We can solve literally any problem by means of using our human reason. So the religious people can do their little things and do their little rituals and whatnot, but when it comes to solving the real problems that all humanity has to solve, there's only one tool that can do that, and that is human reason. Now this was the dominant view. It wasn't the exclusive view of everyone. We read already about the Pietists and the Methodists who kind of push back against this and say, there is more to the human being than just its capacity to think. There's emotion, there's experience, there's other stuff. So there are minority viewpoints, but the unquestioned dominant point of view is this kind of I think, therefore I am, reason determines everything else. So this is the Enlightenment age, and this is the age that kind of comes on the heels of the Reformation, comes on the heels of let's stop these religious wars, let's get together, let's use our reason to overcome the problems that face us. And this is the seedbed of the American Revolution. I mean, like I said, Jefferson read his Locke, Franklin read his Locke. All of these philosophers, these founding fathers, were building on this philosophy. So what this causes them to do is to look at their previous connections, if you will, look at things like nationalism and religious devotion, for example, and say, we can break free of this. And the Americans saw the Church of England as an extension of English rule. So when you have these Englishmen in these colonies, and the independent sentiment starts to brew there, starts to take root, it's almost like going to church at the Church of England is an act of treason to the revolutionary cause, because this particular religious expression is so closely affiliated with the power that they're attempting to overthrow. So again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but again, you have national interests and religious interests kind of acting in tandem, and this is exactly what the Japanese rulers in silence were reacting against. They said, yeah, you missionaries coming in here pushing Christianity, that's not all you're pushing. You're pushing Western nationalism, you're pushing colonialism, you're pushing a different way of living that's a threat to our rule. So we don't like you, we're going to persecute you, we're going to oppress you. And I said a few weeks before, I don't necessarily blame them. The extremes they took, that's another issue, but just being suspicious of these missionaries is perfectly natural, because religious sentiments and nationalist political sentiments ride together quite a lot over the course of history. So you have then, we can't have the Church of England because Church of England represents the monarchy, it represents everything we're fighting against. So in our push for democracy, in our push for self-rule, in our push for self-representation, we also want to push for religious freedom as well. Now, the Americans keep the religious impulse. The French Revolution, a few years later, does its level best to scrap the religious impulse. They look at the religious machinery, the religious institution, and they see it as an extension of the French monarchy that they've just successfully overthrown. So what do? They tear down the churches, and they kill a bunch of priests. Why? Because it's the same impulse, but for whatever reason. And there are reasons, and McGrath gets into the reason. When the French Revolution comes, they try to scrap the religious sentiment entirely. The American Revolution, they don't do that, they just change it. It gets altered. It's not the institutional Church of England anymore. We are still interested in God stuff, but let's keep church and state separate. Let's get rid of the compromised state church. Let's let the pure gospel church live. Now, I want to be careful here, and I know this is a contentious topic, but when I say let the pure gospel church live, I'm certainly not putting that sentiment into the mouth of the founding fathers. There were certain founding fathers that believed that. Somebody like a John Adams, for example, believed that. He comes from a Puritan background. This is very much in his purview. Someone like a Thomas Jefferson, however, is going to look very differently. And someone like Jefferson is more deist than someone who you would classify as quote-unquote pure Christian. And if you don't know, you've probably heard the term deism before. It's kind of the watchmaker God, the God that creates everything, sets in motion, and then steps away and lets natural processes govern what he's created, and humans use their reason to tap into those natural processes and live accordingly. It's not a God of miracles. It's not a God of divine intervention. It's a God of let's start the process and then walk away. That is Thomas Paine's God. That's Thomas Jefferson's God. You can make the argument for Washington. So I want to be careful. I don't want to say that, I don't want to step into the whole was religion, the Christian nation debate yet. I will. But at this point, all I want to say is that part of the reaction against the Church of England in America had nationalist political sentiment. And this push for democracy that characterizes the American Revolution is joined together with a push for religious freedom. Let people worship what they want. And it develops into this phrase, which I'm sure you've heard, the wall of separation between church and state. You know, people say it's in the Constitution. No, it's that phrase is not in the Constitution. That phrase is in a letter that Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut. And I have the link in the notes. You should read it. It's short. You should read it to get a sense of it. But this is where that phrase comes from. But what's really at the heart of this conversation in terms of the wall of separation between church and state, and McGrath takes pains to point this out, what's really going on, at least at the beginning, what's really going on here is not we need to keep Christianity out of public life. It's we need to keep the Leviathan of government out of people's Christianity. We need to let people have the liberty of conscience to be able to worship as they see fit to do so. McGrath quotes Roger Williams, who says, who uses the idea of the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. So what's going on there? Williams is not interested in keeping Christianity out of public life. What he's interested in is keeping the machinations of quote-unquote worldly politics out of people's religious conscience. Let people worship what they want. Don't let a corrupt state church stand in their way. And this is very much the tone that Jefferson strikes in his letter to the Danbury Baptists as well. He says, we don't want to violate your conscience. We don't want to have anything in the government violate your conscience and your freedom of worship. Trust us. We're not going to do anything that's going to, that's going to be a hindrance to you worshiping how you see fit to do so. Excuse me. It is all, your conscience has liberty. And this is very much the initial thrust of the wall of separation of church and state. And you had people arguing against that. The reason they were arguing against that was because, well, how do we maintain the social order? I think McGrath, I think he cites Patrick Henry or some other ones as, because the other side of that argument is, hey, great, you worship what you want, but if everyone's going in different directions, how in the world can we have a cohesive social order? How in the world can we have agreement on anything? And we've already talked about how politics and religion are so often intertwined. How can we have political unity if we don't have some sort of religious unity? So these are the two forces at work. This idea of social order, everyone on the same page together, pushing in the same direction, versus the individual, the liberty of conscience. I will worship as I see fit to do so. These are the two forces at work. It's really interesting because when this phrase of wall of separation between church and state, it began in support of the latter. It began as support of the liberty of conscience. It's kind of swung full circle all the way around, where now when people cite wall of separation between church and state, it's we need to have this kind of safe public zone where social order can be established that's not threatened by crazy religious people. That might be overstating it, but you get the idea. What started out as a protection of the individual from the public square becomes a protection of the public square from the individual, or from the individual church, from the individual religious tradition. It's swung the other way, where McGrath argues, and I agree with him, that the focus of this phrase, wall of separation of church and state today, is protect the social order, whereas it used to be protect the individual's conscience. Now again, this is hotly contested. There's lots of smart people who come down on different sides of this argument. I'm basically giving you McGrath's presentation of this idea and explaining to you why he makes the argument that he makes. But I also want to talk a little bit about the theology of this, because McGrath hits the political aspect, and it's valid and it's interesting. But if you've ever wondered where the politics of this comes, or the theology of this comes from, there's a phrase in the book of John, the Gospel of John, has the upper room dialogues, right, where you have these extended chapters of conversation, Jesus and his closest followers the night before he dies. And in that conversation, you have this idea, and it's not only happening there, but it comes there in a really strong way. It's this idea of being in the world but not of the world, right? Where there's the different, there's a distance between what Roger Williams calls the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, but at the same time you are in the wilderness of the world as the church. What does that look like? And this is a question that's been argued, down the years of time. You have someone like Augustine who starts to use the language of, hey, Christians, church, you are strangers, you are pilgrims. This is not your true home. You're just passing through. The spiritual. But then you have others, most notably people, Aquinas Catholics, if you will, that say, no, this, that language is played down, and it's more, hey, the church and the world can coexist, and can coexist well, and here's how it looks. Here's how it works, and here's what it looks like. So you have very, very different views, and the groups that are going to be more inclined to opt out, more inclined to separate, more inclined to form communities, like the Anabaptists, like the Puritans. They're going to be the ones who are much more in tune to, we are not of the world. Whereas the ones that are much more inclined to assimilate, much more inclined to kind of go along to get along in the political system, are going to be much more in tune to this idea of in the world. Jesus in the scriptures balances both of these ideas when he looks to his followers and says, you are in the world but not of the world. And ever since then, Christians have been trying to weigh that tension, weigh that balance. And typically what tends to happen is that they fall on, they emphasize one side or the other. Your discussion question this week, talking about fundamentalist Christians, and McGrath has some really strong language for them. But the point of that, and the reason I asked you about that, is because this is a beautiful example of people who really stress the not of the world to the point where they downplay the in the world. They kind of pull themselves away from the world, and they take a defensive posture against the world. Like, the big bad world is coming for us, but we need to maintain our purity here. You see it manifested physically in monastic communities, separatist communities, but you also see it spiritually even today in the forms of some forms of fundamentalism and conservative evangelicalism. You see, even though they're living in the world, you still see that mindset play itself out, where we need to keep ourselves pure from the corrupting influences of the world. So it's interesting, and there's a lot of different ways to go there. But I tell you all that just to give you some theological context for this idea of separation of church and state. It's not just a political hot-button issue. There's a lot of deep theology that's woven into it as well. But anyway, with this division, with this separation of church and state, what you end up having is you have this move towards defending the conscience. But what that does is, in defending the individual's conscience and freedom of worship, from the public square, it draws a sharp line between the public and the private. And more, as the modern age commences, Christianity is relegated to the domain of the private. There's not nearly as much space for public religious expression. Religion becomes more and more this thing to be seen as your individualized, privatized. This is your views, your beliefs. They're yours alone. Don't try to force them on me. And this is kind of what you have. So this, as you might imagine, this presents a pretty stiff challenge to traditional faith. And what do I mean by traditional faith? The type of traditional faith that was represented before the Reformation, obviously, but even after the Reformation. Luther wouldn't have had any patience for regulating religion to the private individual. He had a very public perception of what, the function of religion in a society. It wasn't retreat, it wasn't privatization, individualization. Obviously, the Catholic Church has never had this private. It's very corporate, very public. But the movement, and you see it manifested today, and all the people that are surveyed. George Barna and others have surveyed Christians that aren't affiliated with any church at all. That say, we're not connected to the church. We're not religious, but we're spiritual. What does that mean? Well, at its core, it means we're not connected to any type of religious body. We have no public Christian presence. But when it comes to our own privatized conscience, our own privatized, individualized views, we self-identify as Christian. This is, in a lot of ways, this is the natural conclusion of this line of thinking. um, where Christianity in the public square undergoes a really stiff challenge at the hands of the modern age. So how is it going to respond? And McGrath has a really nice, McGrath page 178 is great because he summarizes a lot of the things that Christians and the public face of Christianity has to respond to. There's the Industrial Revolution. The world is changing. The world is going from agricultural to industrial. People are going from rural communities to the cities. People are uprooting themselves. They're moving to find, they're following the job. What does that mean in relation to community? What does that mean in relation to religion? What does that mean in relation to all of these things? Pretty significant changes. The rise of biblical criticism. The modern age, the age of reason, brings an the Enlightenment brings an explosion of knowledge, an explosion of discovery. That energy is also used to study and to make new discoveries about the sacred texts that religious people were using, including the Old Testament and the New Testament. So what does that mean? That means that, from Luther and days before, overwhelmingly the Scripture, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly the Scripture was taken to be literal. We read the Bible and do what it says. But the Enlightenment, modern age, brings higher criticism, biblical criticism, and it comes in a variety of forms. But what it serves to do is it serves to kind of chip away at the foundations of taking the text literally. People start to say, to give you a hot button example. The creation narratives in Genesis 1. I know they used to think it was 6 24-hour days. We don't think that anymore. We think that's allegorical. And the other passages are taken to be allegory, and you get this kind of movement away from literalism, this movement away from unquestioned obedience, if that's a word, where people are starting to read the Scriptures not so much as an act of devotion, but as an act of scholarship. And this goes back to McCutcheon in week 1. We're doing theology, but also we're starting to do scholarship on the theological texts themselves. We're starting to undergo the academic study of religion. And what that means is a pretty stiff challenge to the Bible as it was understood. So you have that. You also have the Darwinian Revolution, which continues to challenge the church in a number of different ways, not least of which the idea of humans being exceptional, being in the image of God. Darwin evolution says, no, you have evolved from other creatures by way of a very long process. Traditional Christian theology says that humans are created in the image of God, and there's a sharp line between humans and the rest of creation. Darwinian evolution appears to challenge that. Christians have to figure out how to reconcile old beliefs with new challenges once again. And then there's the idea of Marxism. And the Catholic Church ends up taking this one head on, as much as any Christian organization does. There's a lot of Catholic teaching that is very much interested in working it out, the challenge of Marxism. And the whole thing, if you've ever studied any Catholic social teaching, which you really should, it's fascinating. But if you've ever studied any Catholic social teaching, some of the encyclicals that came out, like Rerum Novarum, or some of the other ones, even the newest one on climate change, Laudato Si', is an extension of thought of Catholic social teaching. What's Catholic social teaching? Catholic social teaching is an attempt to take the concerns of Marxism seriously. What are the concerns of Marxism? Well, in a nutshell, the plight of the worker, the plight of the working class individual, the plight of the migrant in later days. The Catholic social teaching attempts to take that seriously, while at the same time looking at Marxism as a very great threat, not just to religious sentiment, but also to politics as it's constructed. So they're having to walk that line. They're having to reconcile old beliefs with new challenges. All Christians do it on some level, but this is one in particular where the Catholics are really out in front on it. But the point is, with all of these things, and you should go back and read McGrath 178, it's very helpful, but it's Christians figuring out how to reconcile old beliefs with new challenges. And part of the reaction to that is this idea of separation. We're going to, we see the way the wind is blowing. The world is becoming more modern. The world is becoming more secularized as a result. Fundamentalism arises as a reaction to this secularism, clashes with progressive Christianity. Fundamentalism says, we see the world, the direction the world's going, we don't like it. We're going to stand against it. How are we going to do that? We're going to withdraw from the larger conversations the world is having, and we're going to focus on what we do. They have a very conservative viewpoint. The Scopes trial, McGrath talks about this. The Scopes trial is a key moment in this process, and he gives you the details of that. But what you have is secularization is moving forward in Western Europe and in America as well. Although America, it's slowed. It's not as extreme as it is in Western Europe. Western Europe can absolutely, by any definition today, Western Europe can be classified as post-Christian. The remnants of the tradition are still there, but the devotion is not so much. Most folks think America's heading in that same direction, where the remnants of the tradition are there, but as far as the public life of the nation, it is secularized. And again, kind of swinging back around to the fundamental question, for the Christian community, the question becomes, how do we deal with this? And a beautiful example is Vatican II, the Vatican Conference in the 60s. McGrath writes a lot about it. There's an Italian term that he cites, which is extremely important. It's aggiornamento. I don't speak much Italian, but I read that as aggiornamento. It means modernizing, basically. And what it represents is the stance the Catholics want to take. They don't want to go full fundamentalist. They don't want to say we're not going to have any conversations at all. We're going to relegate ourselves to kind of our own little subculture where we listen to we'll talk about this, where we listen to our own little music and we read our own little books and we watch our own little movies. We don't want to do that. We want to acknowledge that the world has changed and we want to be in conversation with the world as it changes. But at the same time, we want to maintain that which is distinctive in us as Catholics. So we're dealing with the modern world. We're embracing the modern world, but we're doing it in such a way, hopefully, that we don't lose what's distinctive in us. And this word, aggiornamento, comes to kind of summarize that ideal of being in dialogue with the modern world while maintaining that which is distinctive in us. And this is a natural lead to talk about science, because the science, especially the ones that I assigned to you to watch, they're doing exactly the same thing. Last week, I gave you Francis Collins and Catherine Hayhoe, the lectures to watch. And the only reason I did that is because they're trying to do the exact same thing. They are in dialogue with reason in the form of modern science. They're in dialogue with science. They're scientists. They're wonderful scientists. But at the same time, they're not willing to give up on that which is distinctive to them as Christians. They're not willing to throw out the whole tradition, but at the same time, they're not willing to turn their back on the modern age. What do you do? And Collins and Hayhoe provide pretty interesting examples of how to make those two worlds work together, how to bring them together, where they overlap, where are the opportunities for conversation. They do a nice job of that. And that was the reason I gave them to you to watch them. I hope that was helpful to do that. But anyway, so you have this tension. The modern age is here. It's making changes. It's putting some pretty stiff pressure on Christianity. Are we going to withdraw? Are we going to engage? Or are we going to capitulate? Are we going to just assimilate? How is this going to work? And there's a real unsettling. There's a real moment of, well, gracious, now what? And ironically, one of the things that kind of reminds everyone of Christianity's power to function and to function for good in the public square is the civil rights movement. And this, again, just following McGrath's outline. Can religion work in a modern age? And on the flip side of that, can modernity work without religious influence? Because what you had, if you go all the way back to this discussion of rationalism, what you had is I think, therefore I am. Your reason, your existence as a rational agent is the defining characteristic of who you are. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means, the problem of that, let's put it this way, the issue there is that prejudice colors how these people judge who has reason and who does not. And here's what I mean by that. Somebody like Immanuel Kant, another brilliant Enlightenment philosopher, says, rational thinking beings, these are the ideal of humanity. This is what humanity aspires to be. Well, can there be women? No, not really. Well, can there be uneducated men? No, no. What about men from other countries? No, 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 no. What about men who don't own property? No, 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 no. No, that won't work either. So you see what happens. It starts from, in theory, it's rational agents. But what does it turn into? Rational agents who happen to be white, property-owning European males. Everyone else is excluded. So the real question, and what the civil rights movement was brilliant for a number of reasons, but not least of which, it's brilliant because it exposes some of the flaws of modernity. We are going to function purely as rational beings. The problem is there's more to humanity than just our rational thought. We are also a bundle of emotions, and we are the results of our experience, and we're rational agents. We're all of these things together, but that does not contradict itself. We are complicated beings, y'all. And the move towards rationalism as a way to get away from religious conflict made sense, worked at the time, had significant weaknesses because it denied the role of emotion. It denied the role of experience. It argued that if you know what's right, you're going to do it. And you know as well as I do that's not entirely true. We know what's right. I know the right thing to eat. If I got McDonald's on one side and the salad bar on the other, I know what I probably ought to do. But I also know what more often than not I end up doing. And everyone does the same thing. Your decision-making process is more than just your rational faculties. There's more going on. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But the modern age, the rational age, overemphasizes one to the expense of the others. And Dr. Martin Luther King and the leaders of the civil rights movement look at the establishment as it's set up and saying, you've forgotten. Your anthropology is incomplete. You've forgotten something profoundly important about the way people function. And ironically, the way in which they fight that is absolutely religious. Martin Luther King's a minister. He uses religious language. And what you have is kind of the church re-entering the public square in a lot of ways in the civil rights movement. And you have that continue with Pope John Paul II. There continues to be a place for Christianity, particularly in the American and European realms. But it's a challenged place. It's a contested place. It's a place that faces pressures from all sides. And what you come to find out, and McGrath, we talked about the missionary age and how it changed. Do you know how it changed? In the 18th century, in the 19th century, America and Western Europe were the ones who sent missionaries. And they sent them to the quote-unquote non-Christian nations of the world. Do you know that the ratios have reversed and there are more missionaries that are being sent from Africa, being sent from Asia, being sent from South America? And where are they going? They're going to America. They're going to Western Europe. The whole vitality of the faith is up and moved. It's moved south. It's moved to other continents. And Europe and Western Europe and America become missionary targets, not missionary sending centers anymore. So the missionary, it's fascinating how it works, because you have the age of missions, the age of global expansion, Christianity going from quote-unquote Christian nations to non-Christian nations, and it works so well, and there's so much turmoil back home, that given the space of a couple centuries, the roles are reversed. And the Christian nation is in Africa. The Christian nation is in South America. And they're sending missionaries to the non-Christian nations. What are the non-Christian nations? Western Europe and America. So it really, the whole nature of the mission field changed. And it's really fascinating to watch this process. And this is a process that's continuing. And I don't claim to be an expert on it, but this is a process that's going to continue to move as we progress and as we move forward. And it'll be really fascinating to watch. So this is kind of the backdrop, and I tell you all of that to get into our conversation on Christian art. But what I'm going to do is break this up into 2 lectures. So I will see you on part 2 of this, which I will start as a separate lecture.